theology nerds. This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. That's right, the number one theological source of interweb ideological goodness. Basically, it's like the number one theology nerd podcast, because for over 11 years, we've been bringing you some of the best interviews from the Academy right into your earbuds so that you can think with scholars of religion, theologians, philosophers from all sorts of schools of thought and perspectives, and then wrestle with the questions yourself. That's what happens in Homebrewed Christianity, and today I am super jazzed that the one and only Bruce Rogers-Vaughn is on the podcast. Now, Bruce is Associate Professor of the Practice of Pastoral Theology and Counseling at Vanderbilt University's Divinity School. And in this conversation, we talk about a number of his articles, but they're all connected to this book that is now out in paperback, so it's significantly cheaper, called Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age. This conversation is inappropriately spectacular. We got going. We were having such a good, enlightening, powerful conversation. It kept going for a very, very long time. So there's a high chance you're going to come back and listen to different parts of this episode over time, but it was so good. I was so honored Bruce took the time to have such a thorough conversation about a book that I was told by multiple friends, you got to read Caring for Our Souls in a Neoliberal Age. I got the book, and it was even better than all the provocations and pushings and calls to read it. And then when I told Dr. Vaughn that I wanted to talk to him, he said yes. We set it up, had a long conversation. It's all edited right up for your enjoyment right here. So I'm really looking forward to getting feedback, input, and stuff from what you hear, because he is he's a man from the South, a Baptist from the South even. He did his MDiv at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary back before the fall, when it ceased to be an educational institution, and did his PhD at Vanderbilt, and now he's active at a Presbyterian church, but he's a therapist nonstop. So a lot of his reflections are both connecting his work in the Academy and, his work in those one-on-one situations as a therapist. Fascinating conversation. I bet y'all are going to say, Trip, bring him back on. We want more, because it was pretty exciting. Before we jump into the podcast, I want to tell you a few things. First, I want to give a shout out to James Nash. James Nash and Will Rose, new members of the Homebrewed Christianity community. They went to homebrewedcommunity.com, joined up. They are donating every month to support the podcast, which is exciting. My goal is to get 1% of the 70,000 of you that listen to join. And then I will not only be able to pay for my student loans and stuff, I'll be able to level up podcasting game in extraordinary ways. And that's why I want to give shouts to James Nash, Will Rose, for doing so. Very exciting. They became elders of Homebrewed Christianity. Elders that's right. They're the ones very soon, in just a few weeks, probably, right here in the middle of the summer, we're going to be launching private podcast feeds for the elders, which not only includes new special episodes and all sorts of different things, but it includes lectures through an introduction to theology, answering all the different questions, introducing the big figures and concepts that so many of the guests here kind of assume. They're talking one scholar to me, another, or at least I pretend to be one. And a lot of times I get emails from people like, oh, so exactly what's the difference between Paul Tillich and Karl Barth? Or what is kind of this emergence of these different types of liberation theologies, and how do they relate, and that kind of stuff. So what we're going to be doing over the next year for the members is I'm going to be doing an introduction to 20th century theology, introducing the major figures, the major schools of thought, and then engaging with the members to help them feel like they're filling out, that base of theological information that shapes so much of the contemporary conversation. We're doing that. Shout outs, right, to Will and James for joining up. You can too, homebrewedcommunity.com. Don't forget, we have an event coming up in September 27th, 28th. The Called to Be a Prophet event here in Cary, North Carolina. And Brian McLaren's going to be there. Robin Henderson Espinoza, Steve Davison, all going to be in the house. Going to be exciting. Check it out. And I have some exciting news, but we're going to tell that next week. Yep, right? I'm looking at my imaginary engineer who just nodded and said, Trip, tell that next week. So in the meantime, no. This is an exciting conversation, and this episode is brought to you by our friends at the new revisedstandard.com. That's right, Zondervan has come out with beautiful, user-friendly versions of the NRSV translation of the Bible, which I know you know is the one that the super nerds use. Nerdy Bible scholars, when they decide to read the text in English and not in its original language, recommend the NRSV. So what I had was assigned an undergrad in divinity school and PhD. When you're using the Bible, they say NRSV. And now Zondervan has come out with like versions of it that are easy to read, easy to hold, beautiful, and all that kind of stuff, which is a great resource. So good. And they're sponsoring this podcast, which means they think that you might be the type of nerd that wants the nerdy translation of the Bible everybody uses, but also it not to come in that like cardboard framing that most of the translations have come in, because they're basically for the classroom. So go to newrevisedstandard.com. Check it out. Thank you for sponsoring the podcast. Translation of the Bible. I feel like that's an accomplishment. The Bible translation's like, holler at Homebrewed. All right, here we go. Enjoy this powerful conversation with Bruce. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and today, Bruce Rogers-Vaughn is joining the podcast, author of Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age. It's going to be fascinating, exciting, enlightening, provocative, and if I do a semi-decent job of getting some of the goodness in this book out, then you're going to go get the book, Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age. It just came out in paperback, so now it's not, $100. But I'm rather confident that if you are in a helping profession or want to know what the cultural resentment and creeping oppression that is entangling us all in a web of ugly, flattened humanity, then this book is going to be helpful. So thank you so much for joining today.
You're welcome. Glad to be talking with you, Trip.
And you are a professor at Vanderbilt's Divinity School, for those that, are thinking of divinity schools and such.
For academics, yes. I'm associate professor of the practice of pastoral theology and counseling, which means I'll never have a card with that title on it because it's much too long. But your listeners should also know that I have not spent my life primarily as an academic. I was adjuncting at Vanderbilt Divinity School for many years, since 1995 roughly, and joined the faculty part-time in 2010. So I still continue a psychotherapy practice in addition to teaching and writing. So I joke that I have 3 jobs, psychotherapy, teaching, and then I write for free. So
that's, unless you come up with, Hogwarts, then that tends to happen. So
right.
When one of the things I love about this book is not just that John Cobb endorsed it, but that always helps, is that you gave a framework, a narrative, a story, and insights to a predicament that I hear from lots of my friends that are counselors or chaplains or ministers, that there seems to be something that is shaping what drives us into seeking help. So I wonder, how would you introduce our current cultural predicament when it comes to what those in helping professions encounter?
This is an important question, Trip, because late capitalism has shaped our culture, not only in the United States and Europe, but globally now. We've globalized the thing. And one of the things it does in terms of the sort of faith system that it encourages is that we're led to believe that everything originates in individuals. So it's only individual decisions that matter, and what happens in the culture is believed to be the accumulation of individual decisions and behaviors. Now, what this means for distress, mental illness, etc., is that we come to believe that if you're depressed, for example, it's originating somehow inside of you, the individual. It's either in your genetics, it's in your neural pathways, it's in the family of origin that's become instilled in your psyche, and so forth. What we don't pause to think about is the social origins of these kinds of distress. And interestingly, that was an emphasis even here in the United States up through the 1960s. There was a whole field called social psychiatry and community psychology that talked about a depressogenic society instead of talking about neural pathways and genetics. And understand, I'm not saying these have nothing to do with depression, but our social environment and even physical environment have a huge impact on our brains, and there's plenty of research to point that out. So it can become a chicken or the egg question, but certainly the social origins of our distresses and sufferings are greatly overlooked in our time.
Mm-hmm. And in the early part of the book, you talk about how this awareness grew within you, that as you are talking with your peers who are also doing psychotherapy, that there starts to be this connection that you're drawing and intuiting between what's happening in culture, in the media, and such, in the way it shapes and frames the individual when they come. Like when you use phrases like late capitalism or the neoliberal order, and make observations about the way the economy has shaped even our entertainment and the desire to veg out and such. Like how do you frame that in a way that starts to give us a lens to look at the individual predicaments or the individual problems that people like come to you going, hey, I think I'm depressed, or I'm really frustrated, or I'm not content?
Right. I think it's been true for probably forever since we've had helping professions, and now in the modern era, psychotherapy, pastoral counseling, and so forth, that people who are directly working with hurting people, whether it's psychotherapists, pastors, community activists, the insightful people on the front lines, you might say, are the first to notice what's going on and how the wider culture is impacting people. The trouble is, the culture doesn't just stand up in front of your face and say, hey, I'm neoliberalism and I'm the one causing the depression. So it really takes, it's not visible in the room. It's like fish swim in water, but they ostensibly don't see the water. So this is an invisible force that's nonetheless very powerful. And I think it really comes from long-term observation, sitting with people over time. I think I did a calculation before writing the book that at that point I had done over 30,000 counseling sessions in my career. And this kind of long-term, I'm not saying you have to do it that long-term to notice what I'm talking about in the book, but I began to notice that people would come into my office, say depressed. I'm using that as an example because it's one of the most common reasons people come for counseling. They would come into my office depressed, but they would blame themselves for being depressed. They would wonder what they were doing wrong. Obviously, when they watch TV, they go online, they watch the news, they look at infotainment. And all of these things give us the impression, even Facebook. So people put their best, self forward in Facebook. And it gives people the impression that something's wrong with them because everybody else is happy. What's wrong with me? So sadness, grief, mourning, depression tend to go under the radar. And when people hit that stuff, they feel like they are the problem themselves. And there's even empirical research to back up that when people have negative attitudes about having negative feelings, they get even more depressed. So there's actually lots of empirical data on this now. It sounds very abstract to talk about capitalism and neoliberalism, but now psychologists are starting to get in on the act.
Mm-hmm. Well, in one of the articles you wrote on depression and resistance, you talk about having a problem with framing depression in the disease model. Can you kind of share about that?
Right. It's related to what I was saying earlier. So beginning in roughly the 1980s, up until, I'll be specific, up until the election of Ronald Reagan here in the U.S.
Blessed be his name. I know, because you're Christian.
Blessed be his name. Social psychiatry and community psychology, as I said, were quite strong. And there was a lot of research going on in the area of the effect of even politics and economics on people's mental health. So right after, it was within months of Reagan coming into office, a memo went out from the National Institutes of Health saying that they would no longer fund research on anything about the social impact on people's mental illness. All they were going to study now was the brain. So that began then. It continued all the way through. Even in Obama's administration, we had what was called the Brain Initiative. So all the research and money has been piled into pharmaceuticals, investigation into brain chemistry, into neuroscience, and we've almost completely ignored the social origins of depression. So remind me of your question, Tripp. I'm not sure I'm staying with it.
Oh, about the disease model. That's
the disease model.
Yeah.
The disease model leads us there, actually. Mm-hmm. It leads us to look at the causes within the individuals themselves, although I'm reminded by some medical researchers that even medical research looks at the physical and cultural environments when we're talking about physical illnesses. So, but how the disease model actually gets practiced in our time tends to focus on individuals and what's going on in their bodies. So if we look at depression as a disease, we lose a whole tradition, for example, in the care of souls tradition on sadness, mourning, and so forth, that there's value in this, that it has something to say to us. And if we simply try to expunge it, and disease implies that it's something to be treated and gotten rid of. And I think the wisdom of the religious traditions, including Judaism and Christianity, have for centuries said that when you're going through the dark night of the soul, there's something important happening. Mm-hmm. So in that article that you're talking about, I renew the call to listen to the voice of depression. What is it saying to you? I do this in my clinical sessions with psychotherapy patients. You know, if you're hurting, what is that trying to say to you? I'm not trying to valorize suffering as if it's a good thing, but suffering is part of the human condition. Mm-hmm. And so when we're in pain, I think it pays to ask ourselves, what is going on? And what is my pain trying to tell me about not only what is going on with me, but what is going on in my relationships and, in fact, in the world around me. Mm-hmm. So in the book, I talk about individuality as a window into larger questions about the relationships we have and the societies we live in.
Something that came to mind, and I'd be interested in if this is what you were hoping to communicate, that a lot of times as a minister, when someone shares something with me, they come already having decided, right, that this is a problem. And so they come with an identified problem, and they're wanting to help you. They're wanting your help in resolving it. And when the individual both bears the blame of the problem they're bringing, their depression, and then you are giving an explanation to them in whatever your helping profession is, like a religious person might say sin, or you have a chemical imbalance or whatever, then the individual is not only responsible for the fact that it exists, but is responsible for dealing with it. And there's this intense then blame and burden conundrum put on the individual. And what you describe when you're talking about the concept of care of souls in this robust, interrelated relational network is that oftentimes the identification of an individual problem is a culturally acceptable cover-up for toxicity or perversity in the relational dynamic and web that's there. But if you're not allowed to talk about the way the power dynamic of relationships in the larger cultural system is, then all of a sudden the individual is to blame for the problem and tasked with the solution, be it cognitive behavioral therapy or getting a drug or getting a new job or cultivating resilience.
Yes, exactly. You'll hear me sometimes refer to neoliberalism as a faith system. I actually think it is. It has its own doctrines, its own high priest, especially in the banking system and in the government. It's very much structured like a religion. I would say it's a quasi-religion. Part of the faith system of neoliberalism is, as I mentioned before, that everything is traced to individuals making rational decisions in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. So there is a kind of blaming the victim that goes on in neoliberalism. And bring me back to your question, Tripp. There was something specific you were asking about that.
Well, because one of the, I would just say that so often we take, an individual's been trained in neoliberalism to be the one who identifies their problem and brings it out for a solution, and then they get tasked with the job of fixing it, be it medicine, action, change of context, or whatever their issue is. And one of the things I really liked in that rich description of care of souls is it's insisting that the terms of engagement that neoliberalism has brought about, this type of, in the macro sense, deregulation, liberalization, privatization, but in the micro sense, this individualization, where things get shrunk, that so often, if we just engage the questions as the people that are seeking help frame them, we're continuing to task them with a burden that is counterintuitive to the wisdom of almost every religious tradition.
Yes, we set people up with a task that is literally impossible. So saying a little more about that, and many people have written about this, whether it's Foucauldians or empirical psychological researchers. Under the impact of the culture of neoliberalism, we're all made to think of ourselves as little capitals. We're entrepreneurs, all of us. So we build our own brand. I had a patient the other day who talked about walking by a middle school schoolyard, playground, and overheard two middle schoolers arguing and very angry. And one of them yelled at the other one, "You're stealing my brand." Now, this is middle schoolers. So the younger we are, the more we have been impacted by this culture to think of ourselves as entrepreneurs. Now, what goes with that is we are expected to manage ourselves as an enterprise. And that includes the responsibility, individual responsibility, as you mentioned, to manage even our affect. Mm-hmm. So we're coached constantly. I was looking at a corporate professional website yesterday that was coaching us to focus our attention. The key to happiness and success is for you to simply focus your attention on positive things and keep your attention off of negative things. This is an example of what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. So that's the individual's responsibility. If you don't focus your attention and you get sad, it's your own damn fault. You should be able to keep yourself positive, excited, enthusiastic, and happy, because that's the kind of people we need in this culture. Mm-hmm. So it puts all the blame on individuals.
In when you talk about the way in which victims are blamed, it doesn't just show up in in the therapeutic space, but you describe the way our media, the way we frame You talk about like the Washington Consensus, the way reality shows function and stuff, that ubiquitous in our culture is this type of individualistic, hyper competitive framework. And in it, there's not a social, corporate, communal ethic of responsibility, or an awareness that the whole might be problematic.
Yeah, we call it meritocracy, which sounds like a nice word. Who could be against meritocracy? But what it boils down to is people are rewarded according to their own merits. And the merits are defined by late capitalist values, such as ambitiousness, enthusiasm, drive, talent, intelligence, and so forth. So if you don't have these qualities, or you don't nurture them in yourself, too bad for you. We don't have any responsibility to you. You're just reaping what you have sowed or what you didn't sow, as the case may be. And I should add, by the way, let's bring inequality into this.
Yeah.
Economic inequality is a central feature of late capitalism or neoliberalism. And it's happening all over the world, not just in the U.S. It's become so dramatic that, to use the United States as an example, 3 men, and they're all men, hold as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the population of the United States. So here's what happens. Put it with what you're talking about. We emphasize the responsibility of individuals to manage themselves, even including their feelings. And then we deprive them of the resources to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I would call that demonic.
Oh,
I would call it demonic.
Yeah, and maybe you can share a story or two about how the effects of that demonic cultural system shows up for your average minister in conversations. Like what are the moments where I am legion pops out of the mouth of its victims in your congregation and context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm worried about our churches, our congregations, and not only the Christian ones, but Jewish synagogues, mosques, Buddhist temples, everywhere people gather to worship. My fear is that we have largely, pardon the cliche, drunk the Kool-Aid, so to speak, of what capitalism values. So even as pastors, clergy, priests, and other religious leaders, we don't have our eyes and ears attuned. We even begin to think of the congregation itself as a business enterprise, and to think of it in terms of budgetary growth, membership growth, and so forth, and think that we're making essentially business decisions about the congregation. So ministers begin to think of themselves as CEOs, and that's a very different imaginary to go by, and has real consequences in the leadership of congregations, as opposed to the one who cares for souls, whether it be through preaching, through pastoral care, or community activism. But I do think this shows up in our churches. When I read a survey just this week that people who claim to be religious, about half of them claim that there is congruence between capitalism and, say, the gospel. And that amazes me, because I'm an old Baptist. I was memorizing scripture from the time I was 5 or 6 years old, and it makes me wonder if people ever read the Gospels anymore. When Jesus talks about in the Gospels, you cannot serve God and money, or that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get into the kingdom of God. these, I haven't heard these kinds of passages preached on since I was a child in little rural poor churches. I think they embarrass us. And we forget that they're there. And we forget how much Jesus extolled attention to the poor and emphasized poverty of spirit. So I think we bought into this. This is most evident probably in the prosperity gospel movement, but it's not exclusive to it. I think it gets involved in mainline Christianity as well. When we emphasize in our services joy and happiness and exuberance and excitement and almost entertainment in the worship service itself, as opposed to attending to all the moods of the soul, including our sadness and our remorse and our guilt and our shame.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I directly answered your question.
Oh, no. That's very helpful. And maybe you could unpack what you mean by care of souls, because I think a lot. You got two responses. One is like a soul. I don't even know if I believe in that. Sounds too supernatural, mumbo jumbo. And then others, they're like, of course, I'm a minister. What else do I do? I'm a soul carrying machine.
Right. Speaking of a word that's ambiguous, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have lots of baggage around that term. So much so that some people have tossed it out, even in theological circles. Sometimes people don't bring up the word much anymore because it gets associated with a sort of binary, the split between the body and soul, that the soul is non-material and, goes on after this life, but it's not part of our body. I'm very careful in the book and in my other writings to describe soul in such a way to avoid that way of thinking. I describe soul in the book as a fabric that connects us to everything that is, ourselves, other people, the community, the surrounding society, the planet itself, creation, and the eternal. So it's a fabric of connection. This is what soul is. And to me, it's very material. It's not just spiritual as in ethereal. It's part of our daily material lives and the way we connect together materially. So soul has to do with connection. And it's not just an ontology, which what I just said could be taken as an ontology. It's not just the fact that exists. Soul, in particular, in our tradition, is living in that fabric, in that nexus, in the posture of care and love and compassion. So when I talk about strengthening soul, I'm talking about, one, becoming more aware that your fate and your well-being is tied literally to everybody on the planet. Mm-hmm. And two, it's an issue of ethics, of responsibility to care and have compassion and empathy for others. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about soul. Now, neoliberal culture, of course, erodes soul. We've already been talking about this. Mm-hmm. The ideology or faith system of neoliberalism has us think only of individuals in isolation, not of the web that connects us all together. So that's a thumbnail sketch of what I mean when I say soul.
And in the book, you talk about how neoliberalism has become so dominant of a framework, like fish in water. You don't notice it, don't observe it, but it's the most significant factor shaping, you say, how, why, and to what degree human beings suffer.
Right.
How do you see, or how do you describe the narrowing of the cultural and even theological imagination since the 80s, such that the more relational, communal, contextual, structural questions don't get raised, and we get obsessed with best practices or measurable outcomes and those type of things focused on the individual, where they're tasked with, essentially adapting and contorting themselves to fit in an unacknowledged yet kind of reigning system.
Right. I think that we've had some predilections even in our Christian congregations, at least in the U.S. context, to individualism to begin with. So growing up Protestant, growing up Southern Baptist in the South, the emphasis was always on your personal relationship with Jesus Christ. So there was already, even prior to neoliberalism, a propensity to think about salvation as something you have as an individual, that you own it by virtue of your personal relationship with Jesus Christ. So there was some vulnerability, I think, in our spiritual lives, our religious lives, to thinking this way. Now, bring me again back to your question. There's something I'm leaving out, Tripp.
Oh, basically, for me, how is it that recently, and you point this out in the book, the conversations around neoliberalism, recognizing it as a dominant ideology shaping culture, religion, all that kind of stuff, is just it's just now, we're just now becoming conscious of it, and
Right.
In a way. But your task in the book is to show the way it's even shaping care of souls in the religious life, that type of thing. How I could just imagine if other ministers read the book and have the response I did, I will think, oh my, yes. And then I'll think, oh my, what in the world? How do I even explain to, I expect my congregants to resist me pointing out the way that they are being shaped by the demonic ideology of our day. Does that make sense? Once you start to see it, I don't even know how you tell the story, narrate it, and give the insight, because I already know how most of my congregants will resist even acknowledging its presence.
Yes, it has snuck in. You mentioned benchmarking, best practices. These have come to be, we use this language even in our denominations. What are the best practices of preaching? What are the best practices of pastoral counseling? Unaware that we're bringing in with this terminology and these buzzwords, a whole mentality that gets focused on, for one thing, technique. So we begin to think that we as caregivers, if we just use the right techniques, will get the results we're after. And results even begins to be teased apart from people themselves. Results means getting people to feel or do what they should be feeling or doing. Feel happier, for example, or becoming more productive in some way. So we buy in by doing that. What gets ignored or left out is that people become healthy spiritually. Their souls become stronger when they are part of a living, functioning community. And beyond that, society, where people do care about each other more than they care about their own brand. That's how people become healthy. So I say in the book that the best thing we can do as pastors, speaking to Christians for a moment, the best thing we can do as pastors to help people with depression, to help people with their sufferings, is to have stronger communities in our congregations, to not focus just on entertainment and packing the pews, but to focus on the quality of our relationships with one another in the churches. So despite the individualistic ideology of my upbringing and its emphasis on the personal relationship with Jesus Christ, there was alongside of that, in the little churches I grew up in, we're here to take care of each other, even at the cost of personal sacrifice to ourselves as individuals. It's going to be inconvenient for me sometimes to love you and to be committed to the congregation. I fear that we've begun to lose this way of understanding and this way of even feeling that we owe something to one another and not just to building up our own brand, our own happiness, our own success. And this is eating away at congregational life, not only in the United States, but globally. So one thing you may have noticed in the book that I do is we tend to think that the erosion of church attendance and congregational involvement are due to a marketing problem or something, or just to secularization. Mm-hmm. Well, what's happening here is what happened in Europe. It's just an inevitable process of secularization. I just don't think that's true. I think that what neoliberal culture has done is devalued solidarity of all kinds. So we're all encouraged to look out for ourselves and for no one else. And this is eroding communities of all kinds, not just churches, but civic organizations. A few years ago, Robert Putnam wrote a book you may recall, Bowling Alone. Mm-hmm. Robert Putnam is a sociologist at Harvard. And I think it was the year 2000 he wrote this book. So neoliberalism was well underway by then. And he noticed that when he went back to the community that he grew up in, the bowling clubs were gone, And then he began to look around him and noticed that the Kiwanis and the various community organizations were dwindling. Well, this is due to the erosion of public life. So we're against public everything in a neoliberal culture. Public funding of schools, public health. Put anything after public, and politically it's hard to get it done in the U.S. Congress these days. Mm-hmm. Right? Safety net, all public life is being eroded. And this goes for churches too. So if we don't wake up and realize the source of where this is coming from, we'll end up blaming ourselves, just like individuals blame themselves for depression. Mm-hmm. So we've got pastors in denominations shaking their heads, wondering what they've done wrong and not realizing what the enemy is.
Yeah. And
that's more than you ask for, but
no. I mean, I'm just glad trying to ask questions to get so much of the great stuff in the book out. And you talk about how neoliberalism deflates, and you mentioned it there, self-organization. It looks at, it helps us not, turns us away from organizing. It reframes how we see marginalization right. and corruption. In one of the, I think, helpful parts of the book, or insightful, especially for more progressive Christians, is would be the way you see identity politics being an ally of neoliberalism and not a genuine type of resistance to it.
Right. I do talk about that. I say that we have to be very careful to realize how neoliberal agendas and interests are co-opting identity politics, co-opting words like intersectionality, which in themselves have great value. I'm not, of course, trying to get us to take attention away from racial justice or homophobia and things that I'm for, under the impress of the gospel, to have compassion for all. It goes with my understanding of what soul is all about. Mm-hmm. But identity politics, in the way that it's done today in the United States and increasingly in Europe and globally, is that we all withdraw into our little groups, our identity groups, be that whatever they are, which in themselves become our brand. Okay? Mm-hmm. And this erodes an ability to establish solidarity across identities in order to accomplish changes politically and in public policy. So I would greatly recommend a book that I don't mention in my book because I think it came out since then, by Assad Haider, Haider. The book is called Mistaken Identity, Race and Class in the Age of Trump. I think Assad Haider nails it. He says that identity politics and the way we practice it today does not further racial justice. It actually neutralizes efforts for racial justice because it erodes and disconnects the solidarity that is needed to really make changes toward racial justice in this country. And he's not the only one talking about this. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is writing about it in her books. She has a great book where she interviews some of the founding members of the Combahee River Collective back in the 70s, who were a group of Black lesbians in Boston. They actually coined the term identity politics. And in these interviews with these founding members, she shows that, and they say themselves, what today is called identity politics is not what we had in mind when we wrote the Combahee River Collective statement. Mm-hmm. What they had in mind was claiming who they were and valuing that, but also establishing collaborations with other people to bring about justice in the world. And how identity politics is being practiced today is going very much against that.
Mm-hmm. So when we take the question of identity politics, like a couple, the way it shows up, in the congregational level and a lot of public conversation, is whether some group that you can now identify is accepted or not, or valued or not, right? And right. One of the predicaments I've seen consistently in more progressive faith communities is that even the way inclusion works ends up creating congregations that are just as tribal as those that exclude. And what you're being included in is a neoliberal order where this is the religious, community for the enlightened side of the neoliberal order. Right? And and it doesn't call into question the structure that the neoliberal order, the way it shapes our souls, pollutes our environment, oppresses the poor, that in a sense, we put all this energy into having more people brought into a system that is going to then continue to oppress us as a collective.
You're exactly right. So what good does it do, ethically speaking, and for the good of the public, if inclusion means bringing more people to the table of capitalism, to a system that is already by design, is there to produce inequality and put profit over people? So Paul Gilroy is someone to bring up here. Paul Gilroy teaches in the UK. He did the W.B. Du Bois lectures at Harvard several years ago, I think 2008 or so. This was published in a book, I think in 2010. And he said that in the 1960s and early 70s, that the civil rights movement in the United States faced a crossroads. What was it going to consider racial justice to be? What was going to be, what would justice look like if we eliminated racism? Would it be, he said, inclusion into a system, inclusion to the bounties of capitalism, or would it be overturning the system of capitalism? Many activists for racial justice prior to, in the 60s themselves, Martin Luther King Jr., we may recall, was actively talking about against capitalism in his latter years before he was assassinated. And many of the activists, Malcolm X said, as long as we have capitalism, we'll have racism. Well, pretty soon after the civil rights movement, that kind of talk disappeared. So today, when we talk about racial justice, we hardly ever mention capitalism. It's as if we get all people of color included into the capitalist system and flourishing like privileged white people, then we'll have a just system. This is a terrible problem. So I think Paul Gilroy was correct. We need to look at what is intrinsically wrong with the system instead of just including everybody into it.
And the other side is there's like you're slightly more progressive and you recognize how certain individuals, because of their location or intersectional oppression, start behind. And so we need to structurally change things so they start even. But there's still this assumption that we will have the most flourishing human life if everyone has we live in a meritocracy where everyone gets equal support. So like even if you did reparations or something like that, we would get to a point, well, now everyone starts approximately equal, so we can now go back to competing and things. So like even the framework for some of the more progressive responses assumes that there are dials we could turn where we don't have to switch the computer that we're turning the dials on. And I think that's I think one of the things that popped in my book or popped to me when reading the book is the multi layers of suffering. And you developed that concept of the third order suffering. Maybe you can spell that out, because I found that to be super helpful, because in one sense, you want to recognize the systemic historical injustices, and you also want to recognize the complexity of the order and how attention or demands made in a certain tone or shape actually keep the dominant problem in play.
Yes. So a word about that, what I mean by third order suffering, and why do I use that term? Well, like most scholars, I made it up. But let me say what I mean by it. First order suffering to me is theologically, let's talk about it theologically, it has to do with human finitude, the fact that we are creatures. So we're all going to die. We're all subject to illness. We're limited in space and time. And we're not all knowing. And there are a lot of sufferings that come from that, just from being a human being. Mm-hmm. We grieve the losses of people and things that we care about. This is first order suffering. Second order suffering is suffering that is, strictly speaking, unnecessary because it's due to injustice. So these are the sufferings we impose upon one another, either personally by betrayal of people, of friends and others, culturally by war, by discrimination and racism and sexism. These impose tremendous suffering, of course, physical death and psychological death in some cases. Third order suffering is a different animal, and it's hard to even talk about it because it's a new paradigm. So third order suffering is suffering that comes from the loss of institutions, of collectives in which we belong. I've already talked about the erosion of collectives. What goes with that is the erosion of what Robert Denis Dufour, a French philosopher, calls soteriological narratives. The philosopher is actually using a theological word, soteriological narratives. So we lose a symbol system with which to even understand what is happening to us. We lose the language to describe it. And finally, it's the fragmentation of the self at the psychological level. It's no longer having a sense of being a cohesive self, a cohesive human being, a sense of falling apart, so to speak. what goes with that as well is what I call a double unconsciousness. So there's an unconsciousness of where our sufferings are coming from, i.e. the social origins of suffering in particular. That is disconnected from the suffering. So our suffering no longer makes sense to us. And two, and this is even more weird, is we have suffering that's not conscious of itself as suffering. So way back in 1956, Erich Fromm, you may remember that name. Mm-hmm. He wrote a famous book called Escape from Freedom. But he wrote another book, a little less known, called The Sane Society. That was actually a misnomer. It should be called Insane Society. But in that book, Fromm coined a term that he called the pathology of normalcy. He said that not only individuals, but entire cultures could become sick. And when they become sick, and he pointed to capitalism in particular, when the culture becomes sick, those of us who participate in it understand ourselves to be normal rather than sick. So it is a pathology of normalcy. And he pointed to some of the same things I'm talking about. He was sort of a prophet, I think, about where we are today. He talked about alienation. He talked the breakdown of solidarity. He talked about people blaming themselves for their problems and all the things we've been talking about in this interview. So third order suffering is also that pathology of normalcy. A more recent psychoanalyst named Christopher Bolus calls this normatic illness. Normatic illness. And so we have people today who are, by any measure, depressive, who don't necessarily think of themselves as being depressed. Why? Because they're so busy trying to regulate their own affect to conform to the expectation of being excited and enthused and ambitious and happy. That's really going on. I'm seeing it in my office, in my psychotherapy office. People who are not aware enough of their own suffering to know that they're suffering. So Eric Kasdan, in a wonderful book called The Already Dead, talks about this as the new chronic, that we're all like diabetics sustained on insulin. So we're okay, but we're just on the verge of a complete breakdown. He calls that the new chronic. And this sort of lack of consciousness of the state that we're in is the state of being already dead. So I say in the book, we're actually living a kind of zombie existence within neoliberalism, or at least many of us are. Mm-hmm. We're walking around and we're falling apart, but we're not aware of it.
Yeah.
Now, to circle back to your question, I don't think third order suffering has displaced first and second order suffering. It's risen up beside it and gets entangled with it. So they don't even look like they used to look.
Right.
So we have forms of racism that don't even look like racism anymore. Mm-hmm. They deny that they're racist.
Yeah.
We have forms of patriarchy that don't think that it's patriarchal. I don't think I have to explain this much if you watch television and politics in the United States.
Well, I'm not sexist. It's just for some reason I didn't like Hillary, and Elizabeth Warren creeps me out. But it's not because they're women.
This is a bipartisan issue, though. By the way, it's both Democrats, Republicans. It's all of it.
But and here is okay. So your description is simultaneously depressingly shocking and seems too accurate, and redirecting and liberating for me, thinking just as a minister and as a parent and a friend and stuff, that a lot of times the primary focus for religious communities is giving someone first a place to deal with their first order sufferings.
Right.
Dealing with finitude, something to do when you're facing death, and something to help your kids not get pregnant and use drugs before they get out of high school.
Right.
And those type of things. And then for those who start to do some type of social analysis, you realize there's systemic and cultural and historical injustice, and you start to address it. And one of the things at least the connections got much more clear to me when reading the book, that if you identify this shift in capitalism to late capitalism, starting with in the United States, Reagan, and this moved to towards this individualization that then alienates people across cultures and across the society from institutions, from access to symbolic logics to help frame their meaning, purpose, and goodness and such in the world. And then their own subjectivity and their self is under siege. If you don't recognize that, then the anxiety that comes from that double unconsciousness that you're talking about is going to be the primary reactive point when you're just trying to address second order suffering, right? So one of the things that blows my mind when I was working with, quote, liberal people, but of privilege, very privileged in Palos Verdes Estates, California, to being back in the South and talking to people here that have a very different cultural legacy around issues of race and injustice, is that even if you're with people who see the structural stuff, there is this cultural resentment underneath things, or this antagonism that doesn't get named, that raises our anxiety. And then we just tell ourselves a story where we can, outsource responsibility for the issue or try to make a tweak to a system or whatever. And almost always for the privileged, insightful people, the issue's external. And one of the gifts of your work is, especially for leaders, is to go like, no, this third order suffering, this collective is a cultural predicament, and what it's doing is if you use the demonic language, the people with power and privilege are likewise possessed in such a way that they can't imagine the type of transformation, healing, salvation, and justice that's necessary to address the other sufferings, because they can't really acknowledge that they got to get exercised. And and if you're only talking at those people with access and power on the terms of second order suffering, like, homophobia or white privilege or whatever the issue is, then the third order suffering stuff unaddressed that neoliberalism has stuck in us, then we just get anxious, resentful, start fighting, and no progress is made, and the system is kept intact. And
exactly right. So if you don't know where the suffering's, if you don't know where the suffering is coming from, we start outsourcing it. Like you said, it must be the immigrants. It must be poor people who are unambitious. It must be whatever. And there's plenty of empirical research showing that we actually lose empathy for other people. So the more people have socioeconomically, it's correlated to a loss of empathy for others. If you think about that, that's a sobering thought. So, and I think you're right, too, that even the privileged suffer more under a more unequal system that we have today. The erosion of soul occurs there, like you're saying, and partly in a lack of awareness, not only of their own suffering, but especially maybe of the suffering of other people. Now, this edges on something I want to mention, too, because very, very important. When we start thinking and switching about, in this sort of double unconsciousness we're in of third order suffering, and that's now disguising even sexism and racism so that we don't recognize it for what it is, it sounds hopeless, right? I mean, how do you go from being unconscious of something to be conscious of it, and then to know where it's coming from? And I think in the academy, and maybe even in the churches, we begin to think that we can educate our way out of this. If we just have everybody read my book, for example, it's going to solve the problem. I wish I could say that were true. It would sell more books, but
they don't even have
it's
to
not the case.
You have to buy it and sleep on it. You put it under your pillow.
So I'm working on a chapter now for a book that's co-edited by a couple of my colleagues on post-colonial images for pastoral care, where I'm going to talk about this, that I don't think there's really an engine for change. until we break down and grieve. So mourning, sadness, shedding tears over the condition of our planet and what we're doing to ourselves and to each other, sorrow and remorse is the beginning of change. There's an old adage by Khalil Gibran back in the day when he was so popular as a poet. He wrote somewhere, "We may forget those with whom we have laughed, but never those with whom we have wept." And to me, that captures something of what I'm talking about. I see it myself. When people can weep either literally or metaphorically, when they share their pain with each other, they begin to discover that it is a shared pain. It's not just an individual pain.
Mm.
And this works across identities. When we see people who are different from us have a similar pain, the light bulbs begin to come on. And we go, oh, we're really more alike than we are different. Something begins to change. So I'm not hopeless in the face of what I write about in the book. I mean, to talk about monopoly capitalism and third order suffering seems, that it's so total that we have no chance against it. But we really do. And it comes from returning to gathering together and starting by sharing our pain with one another.
And when you say that, and we talked a bit about this before the interview, one of the situations I hear most from people that listen, and many of them are ministers, but many of them are just intellectually curious people of faith, or used to be people of faith. And for those of us with access to education in the United States, we were told a story that, you got to get your degrees, you go to the best schools you can get into, and, if you can get into the next degree, do it. And so I regularly get emails from people who are, starting at their first church and say something like, I got $80,000 of student loans to become a minister so that I could then learn that the God I encountered growing up in my congregation has a much bigger dream for our world than I ever knew. And now I have this type of a debt slavery to going and serving in a place where I will succeed by not challenging the neoliberal order and the assumptions at the heart of a very individualistic faith, but by helping the church make good stewards of the system, citizens of a nation state, and hopefully future tithers to a religious order that is no longer successfully providing the community and narratives and things that can challenge things. And there's such a grief. And the crazy part is, the more successful you are in the whole becoming an adult and establishing yourself, the more likely you've moved 5 or 6 times, going to different places to get degrees, then to like an internship and move up another job. By the time you have some agency really about where you live, you've been alienated from the community you were born into, your family, your friends, and you are an in-debt, isolated, intellectually gifted person formed to contribute to a system that's pillaging the planet and destroying the poor and has already sucked the life out of you. And
you've joined the privilege to some degree.
Right. And
in the process become alienated.
Right. And so I say that just because that's a situation for a lot of people I know that listen to this. It always has echoed with me. If I could go back in time, I would just say, Trip, graduate debt-free. You don't need a PhD because you probably aren't going to get to use it. And you remember when you used to think about starting an alternative community? Well, it's a lot easier to do when you don't have to come up with a couple $1,000s a month to pay for your education bills. And I'm not the only person. Or you want to say yes to being a public school teacher and investing in things, but you have your student loans. So for my generation, those a little younger than me, that I was their youth minister and campus minister, that what we're talking about isn't far off, right? Like it's connected to those narratives you're given in church, because the church narrative is connected to that neoliberal citizen success narrative. And so what do? We celebrate everyone that got into Harvard because they can owe $100,000 when they finish undergrad.
Right. Well, you're touching on something that is extremely important. That's the whole issue about debt. Mm-hmm. Debt is not unrelated to neoliberal capitalism. The way neoliberalism functions, economically speaking, is through financialization.
Right.
So what financialization means is that money is made off of money instead of being made off selling goods and services. So there's various, if you go online, there's various estimates about how much of the capital, the money flowing around the planet, is being made from selling goods and services versus selling financial products. And estimates are as high as 70-something% of the money, profits being made in the world now, is by selling financial instruments like credit default swaps and securities of various kinds. You think about that, that's amazing. And it has tremendous theological implications. But on the ground, one thing that debt does, like you said, is it binds and ties us and probably gags us. So we live in a kind of debt servitude where we have to keep working to pay off debts. We don't have time to join an activist group because we're too damn busy paying off our debts. So it binds us in very practical ways. It also binds us spiritually, because to be a debtor is to feel bad about oneself. So put that back into the individualization we talked about earlier. We take on debt now and we feel at fault for having debt. It's our fault. I'm the one who signed the document to take on the debt. What it leaves out is the whole system is structured so that you must take on debt. Mm-hmm. So you, to get your PhD, had no choice but to go into debt, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Or
I did live
unless you got a scholarship. Right.
Well, even with scholarships.
Even with scholarships.
Yeah.
But more importantly, Trip, people are going into debt just for food and clothes and shelter, because the massive inequality we have today is suppressing wages. Yeah. People are working their asses off, not making a living wage. So about 3 years ago, the Federal Reserve of the United States did a survey, and they discovered that for over half the people in the United States, said, if I had an emergency that cost $400 or more, I wouldn't be able to pay for it. In other words, they would either have to sell something or borrow money. Well, guess what we do? We borrow the money. Mm-hmm. That's what the system is set up to do, is to lend us money. So it's a false narrative in politics in the United States to blame people for being in debt. The system requires them to go into debt. It used to be back in the 50s, one wage earner could make a living for an American household, generally speaking. Robert Reich has pointed this out.
Yeah.
Then by the 1970s, it took two wage earners to have the same level of living that one wage earner had in the 50s. Now we've gone past that. Two wage earners cannot maintain the same level of living. They have to go into debt to do it. So it's an insidious system that forces us all into debt peonage. All of us, regardless of identity. Now, it does disproportionately affect marginalized people, people of color. Mm-hmm. African Americans in the United States are in far worse financial condition overall than whites. That is true, and it's important to note it. But when we note that, we often elide the fact that most whites are in that boat too. So sometimes when I write about this, I teach a course called Race and Class at Vanderbilt Divinity School. And sometimes I refer to people otherwise known as white. People otherwise known as white are working class white people and people who are struggling to make a living who really don't realize they're white. They're not white. Not financially.
Mm-hmm.
James Baldwin once said, "You're not white, and as long as you think you are, there's no hope for you." He also said that when he talked about white supremacy, he was talking about Chase Manhattan Bank. So we're living in a time, this is another third, I would say maybe this is, I'm just thinking about this as we're talking, another way third order suffering can appear is by this displacement.
Yeah.
So we become unconscious of the fact that we're not white. Because if you're not wealthy, you're not really a big participant in white supremacy. You're just sold a bill of goods by wealthy white people to think of yourself as white. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're told to rack up debt to simulate it.
Correct.
And then when you can't simulate it anymore, then you are alienated from those people because the class division is pretty significant, and it showed, like, as someone who was a minister for 8 years to the 1%, very much the 1%. Like, my Christmas gifts were inappropriate. Like I've only drank $200 bottles of wine because I was given them as a gift, and then I didn't look. I was like, this is good, and I look it up on the internet and was like, I should have sold it, but. Even in that situation, this book helped me make sense of a couple of things. One is like, in following up with people that disengage from the community, the number one reason in our congregation, so this isn't like a survey of a lot, but just in going to talk to people over 8 years, was some type of financial trouble in the family, often a loss of job, and they won't even tell anyone. So the moment they can't fake the performance of being in that class, they disengage, which is like the very time you need community and care and support the most. And the other was, like, during the financial collapse, there are a number of, in the top 5 banking institutions, executives, and one called me and we had a conversation, and he was near suicidal, and explains to me how when you talk about the financialization of debt, I go and meet him where he is, and he's explaining how they got in this situation, and and buying and repackaging debt and selling it, selling the American dream to people and giving them loans for homes they can't afford, like, laying the whole thing out. And he's like, and we knew this was going to happen. I just didn't know it was going to happen now. And I'm like, well, if you knew it was going to happen, why? Well, like, we have demands of our shareholders, and if the other banks are going to do it, we're going to do it too, because you aren't going to make money that way, right? Well, then he's there right before Christmas, flying across the country, firing middle management, even though they were obeying what he asked them to do. And then I'm thinking of my rural, poor family who were affected by this in all sorts of ways that he doesn't know, because I'm just his minister, that he probably never asked what class I came from. So, like, I'm sitting there and he's like, I just don't even know if I can do this. I don't know if I want to go on, but I do know if I said no, I would just get replaced, and it's going to happen either way. Right. And so both the actual mechanism of that sets up the crisis and the taking out of the people that were just agents, who's sitting at the top, like he's second in command at the bank, is like, he himself knows he's a cog. And like, for that whole time, I've thought about that experience so much, and connecting it to how impotent he felt, even though in my natural response, I like, you could do something about this. And he's like, no. And he was there just because he bought the same story, I did, but I ended up with a PhD,
Right.
but in going to the best business school and then moving around, and there he is, alienated from his family, alienated from his community, and his taskmaster, global debt management, was sending him around to ruin a bunch of people's holidays. And he didn't know if he could.
So he feels caught in the system too.
Yeah. And that's why
lacks freedom in a sense.
Yeah. And so that whole notion of third order suffering and the way, like even the financialization of our order, that's new, right? Like, it's not like the percentage of the economy that is money that makes money has continued to grow. And so that's even alienating the market itself from production.
Correct. And we have to be careful about the ways that we're complicit with this in congregations and even in the ways we preach the gospel. So I don't know if I sent the article to you, Tripp, that I wrote on the article entitled I'm the King of Debt.
Oh, yeah.
About Reflections on Debt in the Age of Trump.
I know. And I'd always do the debt version of the Lord's Prayer. It was very problematic.
Yeah. So I mentioned in the article that we can become complicit when we think of salvation, for example, and sin in terms of debt and debt forgiveness. It's easy to do because there's some scripture passages that talk in this language. But to talk about being indebted to God turns God, as Adam Kotsko says, into the great creditor. And pretty soon, God is a sort of anthropomorphized and divinized banker figure that we owe our lives to. And salvation becomes Jesus dying on the cross to cancel out our debts. Well, the more we preach that kind of gospel, the more we're sort of validating going into debt, thinking about being guilty for being in debt, and so forth. There are other ways to talk about salvation that I've mentioned that are as old or older than thinking about being indebted to God. And we see this mostly in Eastern Christian traditions, where sin was thought of as alienation from God, being separated from God and from each other. And salvation is about being reunited and coming back together again. To me, this is a much more timely way of thinking about salvation in a neoliberal age.
Mm-hmm. No, I think the article's great. Hopefully, we can share it when we release the podcast, because that one and the other one was on how mourning, blessed are those who mourn, is an act of resistance, as a way of like reframing the disease model.
The title of it is "Blessed are those who mourn depression as political resistance."
Mm-hmm. So when I mentioned I was talking to you, a number of people that have read your book and were part of telling me you had to come on the podcast asked me to ask you how, for those that work with college students and in the university context, how would you help frame an understanding of vocation and the task of education in a way that's not where you aren't becoming, as campus ministers or ministers to students, complicit in really shaping their theological imagination to be compliant with neoliberalism,
to be captured by the education industrial complex, that puts more students into debt and teaches them that they need to focus on the STEM subjects in order to have a job, for example.
Yeah.
And gets away from critical thinking about the things we're talking about right now. In other words, we're funneling students at the college level into tracks like your friend that you were talking about a while ago. So they become cogs in a system. And then they end up there and they wondered, how did I get here? Well, the education system largely funnels people into those tranches. So I guess your question at a practical level is, what do we do in campus ministries? How do we talk to students? I think we can help them become more aware of the things we're talking about. But ultimately, of course, Tripp, the answer to this is a system change.
Mm-hmm.
So it simply is, in my understanding, sinful that public education in the United States does not go at least through college. Now, I'm not saying everybody should go to college or that all education should be college education. I'm not saying that at all. But those who feel called into fields and into disciplines where they're going to need a college education, to have to go $50, $80, $100,000 in debt to do that, that's a sin. That is a sin. I have patients in my practice right now who are carrying $50, $80, $100,000 in student debt, and it's going to take them decades to pay it off, if ever. And it is literally determining their life decisions, like whether they can get married, whether they can have children. This is an enormous burden for people to bear.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, we need to talk to college kids and in the meantime, we have to survive, and be supported in a system that hasn't yet changed. But I hope we don't become so supportive of people that we sort of anesthetize them to the need for change. So much of the change we're talking about is going to have to come at a social and political level. So maybe we should encourage college students to get politically active, and active in the community. Join something.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean connecting on Facebook. It means joining face-to-face relationships with people for change.
Mm-hmm.
Joining, starting a political movement or joining one.
And I think Protestantism, from early Protestantism, the concept of vocation, in the Protestant work ethic and thing, has set up that the church has understood itself to helping make good workers. And now
right.
That is coming to bite us in the back.
It's coming to bite us in the back. So I'm going to let you know, I don't only plug my own book. You may be aware of Catherine Tanner's new book.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've interviewed her yet, but Christianity and the New Spirit of Capitalism. She talks about that exactly. So that's a good resource for ministers as well.
Mm-hmm. So the one of the other topics that that came up was, how do you frame a number of things that are the university system's what gets pointed at, but where you have kind of progressive outrage, public shaming and virtue signaling around issues, the desire for things like safe space or trigger warnings, free speech fights, and that type of thing, because he came from two campus ministers that we were talking, and they said just the campus itself is more anxious and divided and contested than 10 years ago, than 20 years ago. And most of the leadership is scared of it and doesn't know how to manage it. And I wonder, as people helping to think of care of souls, how to frame both the desires and moves for justice and such, and also the way the technology and our culture is helping us frame dealing with those issues.
Yeah, so the question is about, I'm not sure, is it about trigger warnings and microaggressions and how to put that in context, or?
Yeah, well, and how the campus life has become more intense, more activist, more ideological over time.
Mm-hmm.
And what ministers who are campus ministers who would actually agree with the issues around around economic justice, racial justice, the environmental concerns and things like that, are also going. The students themselves are more anxious, having more interpersonal conflict, less at home in their bodies and things. And so, like, is there a way in which the way the culture is performing, engaging these issues, is actually turning to a type of self-harm of sorts for those that are the activists and pushing the agenda? Or how do you frame dealing with those issues in ways that helps the person mature, as opposed to
this tends to be a bit of a quagmire. It's a very thorny issue because on the one hand, we do want to be aware of trauma and how people are affected and be sensitive to that. But this can get in sort of entangled in the current way identity politics is practiced that we were talking about earlier, and used to shut people up instead of inviting people to talk. So you were mentioning free speech. Free speech should not be used as an excuse, as it currently is in some political circles in the United States, for hate speech. But I'm also concerned that when we survey students graduating from school, and this includes even Vanderbilt Divinity School, we have a large number of students saying that they did not feel safe to speak in class. When I ask students about this, they come back to what you're asking about, that they're afraid that they wouldn't use the right word or that people would get angry with them for voicing their perspective. In other words, they would get accused of being politically incorrect or insensitive in some way. And I'm afraid this is hurting the sense of community in our academic programs, not only in theological schools, but colleges around the country. There was a recent article written by Yasha Monk, M-O-U-N-K. I think it might have been in The Atlantic. You could find it by Googling it online, about political correctness. And he was actually citing an empirical study just done in the United States that suggested that the vast majority of people in the United States have problems with political correctness, just using that term. And the interesting thing was that this went across racial identities and the sorts of identities we were talking about earlier. In fact, the only people who were outspoken to protect politically correct speech were rich white people in the study. So this gives me pause to ask about what's going on. And I don't have all the answers to it, Tripp, but I think it is entangled with the culture of late capitalism or neoliberalism in the ways that things become distractive from the real issues that are going on with people. So neoliberalism has all kinds of ways of covering its tracks or covering its ass, so to speak. And one of the best ways is a distraction. You know, it's not your lousy paying job, it's the immigrants at the border. You know, is a technique that's used in all kinds of ways.
And one of the things that comes to my mind, and I've thought about it enough to know I want to think about it, is how the politics of recognition reshape the ethics for relating to each other. That when you get a more flattened sense of transcendence, and that culture and becomes the place you get recognition and identity, then as opposed to God, family, and all the web of interrelationships that used to exist before neoliberalism kind of isolated us. Then, when you present yourself in any context, the other, at the beginning of any interaction, is now already kind of ethically mandated to recognize you on the terms you want to be recognized on. And so it like in the same time you want people to be recognized and be able to present themselves in whatever way, it's also an ethical imposition on the other person who may not understand or may not have a framework or may just be a jerk. Like, but you don't know. But it does put this where the other becomes there are obligations on them to affirm you in a way that recognizes and justifies your own identity, and that I think can be problematic without the actual quest for inclusion and acceptance being problematic.
So you were asking about sort of the politics of recognition and microaggressions and so forth, which is something I've been very attentive to as a clinician and in the classroom, because trauma is a real thing, and we do have to be cautious sometimes around this. But there's another side to this that I think you're alluding to. And I was reminded of some of the work of Wendy Brown, who is a political scientist out in the California public university system. She's also written a lot about neoliberalism. One of her more recent books, Undoing the Demos, is about, I think the subtitle is Neoliberalism's Stealth Revolution. But an earlier book she wrote was called States of Injury. And in that book, she notes that in the United States, people feel they have political power only when they're injured in some way. If they can prove they've been harmed or victimized, then they earn political capital. This has come back to bite us in the butt, of course, because what happens now is that white people have to insist that they're also injured. And so you have white supremacy coming back in the form of aggrieved white people claiming they've been discriminated against because they're white. Mm-hmm. So when you set up a system where political power is based on states of injury, you're kind of asking for or setting up a situation where eventually white men, for example, are going to get on a political bandwagon and claim to be harmed. And we're seeing this right now, of course, in the United States. Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of racism entangled up in this. But it's also in part fed by a political system that will lend power only to those who can prove they've been injured in some way. This is not the way we framed civic discourse 50 years ago, much less 100 years ago. And it's not the way we've framed discourse in the churches. That you should only be recognized if you're injured. Mm-hmm. Which is not to say that we shouldn't recognize when people are harmed. We just should not build our relationships on that basis alone.
And so when you're talking to an individual and, pressing that distinction, like what things have you learned in doing so that could help community leaders, ministers and such, foster both cultures and communities of harm reduction and ones whose identity involves solidarity with those who are being harmed and exploited, and cultivating a community that gives and empowers one to have a sense of self where their identity as injured or victim or whatever isn't their primary one. Is that I'm trying to figure out what the communally embodied response looks like.
What in other words, is there a way to cut across that so that we can hear one another again? Mm-hmm. Well, let me come back through two steps to answer that, to respond to that. One is, I mentioned earlier that we can't educate our way out of this. Education alone won't do it. We've got to mourn. we've got to grieve together. We've got to realize that we have a shared grief. So what that makes me think about in responding to your question is the thing that inevitably gets left out of this politics of recognition and identity politics is class. Class gets eliminated from the discussion. Mm-hmm. In fact, in that same book by Wendy Brown, States of Injury, she mentions what she calls the multiculturalist mantra: race, class, sexuality, gender, etc. She says, inevitably, the only term not defined in that mantra is class, not theorized. I mean, she says we theorize the heck out of all those words except the word class. And I don't know why that is. I think there's still an understanding that, or an assumption that we live in a classless society in the United States. I think some people fear being called a Marxist if they start theorizing class, which of course Marx had a lot to say about class. But this brings up another plug here, Tripp. I wrote a chapter of a book that was edited by Nancy Ramsey. The book is called Pastoral Theology and Care, Critical Trajectories in Theory and Practice. I wrote a chapter in that called Class, Power, and Human Suffering. And it's chapter 3. And in that, I argued that class used to be a prominent thing that we talked about in the churches back in the United States in the 19-teens and 20s during the social gospel movement. Class was all over the discussions, even in pastoral manuals. Mm-hmm. Like Washington Gladden talked about class in his book, The Christian Pastor. Walter Rauschenbusch, of course, emphasized class and class struggle. We don't do that anymore. Class language has disappeared from congregations, and it's disappeared from classrooms. It's disappeared from public forums, largely. And the unfortunate thing about that, to come back to your question, is it leaves us without an obvious way to connect with each other. Mm-hmm. I've said to my students in the race and class course, you can't talk about race or racism without talking about class. And I would say you can't talk about class without talking about race. They're entangled up in each other, even though they're not identical.
Yeah.
So in the neoliberal age, so to speak, it's become more important to talk about class than it has been for quite a while because of the extreme inequality we're now living under. So there's something tragicomic to me about all of us arguing over our different injuries and our identities when we're all being eaten. You know, I can picture almost a political cartoon where there's people in a boat arguing about their identities, and there's this humongous megamouth shark coming up behind them that's about to devour the whole boat. Mm-hmm. So, we need to be talking about the shark.
Yeah.
So I think there is a way through this that does not diminish in the least. In fact, I think it magnifies attention to race, gender, and other issues of social justice by realizing how class power is operationalized to hurt people who are marginalized. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So it gives us a sort of common language to bring us together while also listening to our differences.
Mm. So one of the things I was interested in how you saw it playing out is how our growth in connectivity via the internet, social media, and things is exacerbating or changing the neoliberalism's kind of sieging of the self.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is providential, I guess. You're asking me a subject that I'm writing on at this moment. The chapter I'm working on for the post-colonial images of pastoral care book is, of course, how neoliberalism is the new form of coloniality. But I open up the chapter talking about the internet, because one of the favored images within pastoral theology literature for the past 25 or 30 years is the living human web. I've used it myself in our conversation today. Mm-hmm. But the image of the web harkens our attention back to the internet. Well, Robert McChesney has a great book. I think my computer is sitting on top of it as we speak, called Digital Disconnect. Mm-hmm. And he points out how that in the 70s, when the rudiments of what would become the internet were beginning to come into place, and the early 80s, the internet was an open forum. It was a very democratic platform, for people to get together and have open discussions without surveillance, without censorship, and so forth, and without power struggles. He said what happened in the 1990s is the internet was quickly overtaken by monopolies. Yahoo, Google, Microsoft, Apple, and others, Facebook, Amazon. Mm-hmm. Amazon, by the way, does not make most of its profits through buying stuff off Amazon. It makes most of its money through Amazon Web Services. Mm-hmm. You know, it literally owns a lot of the hubs that what we call the internet work through. At any rate, he points out that capitalism has overtaken the internet. Monopolies now own it. So when you go on a search engine, you're coming up with search results that are handed out to you by the monopoly that owns that search engine. So it is not, as it turns out, it has not become the democratizing platform that it was advertised to be at the beginning. It is caught up in everything you and I have been talking about, right, this whole time. So the image that I'm posturing at the end of this chapter is to think of what it would mean to think of doing pastoral care within the dark web. So not literally, of course. I'm talking about the metaphor. Mm-hmm. The dark web is much smaller than the visible web. There's a new book out by Gale called Weaving the Dark Web. The name is GEHL. He says there's billions of websites on the visible web, probably only 4,000 or 5,000 on the dark web. He's an expert on research in the dark web. I'm using the dark web as a kind of an imaginary for those who have been cast aside as waste material by a neoliberal world. Those that Zygmunt Bauman calls human waste. Mm-hmm. Those that Saskia Sassen talks about as the expelled. These are people who contemporary capitalism actually has no use for, either as consumers or producers, right? Mm-hmm. Because of how unequal the world has become. This also, I think, includes people who have value systems and beliefs that are contrary to the neoliberal faith system. So people like you or me that might believe in solidarity and making sacrifice for other people's good or for the good of the whole would be cast out into the dark web. So I'm thinking of pastoral care kind of in a post-colonial sense. We exist on the margins of this empire. How are we now to gather our resources? Mm-hmm. How are we to support one another through these times? And how are we to mount anything that could be called a resistance? So, the internet, and to come back to a more practical answer to your question, the internet through social media in various ways now is complicit in alienating us from each other. I do think platforms like Facebook and Instagram and so forth can help in connecting us to each other if we already know each other. But I don't think you can build a community on Facebook among people who've never actually met each other.
In one of the crazy things about it is how if you want to preserve relationships in an economy that moves you around all the time, then your only real way of doing it ends up being through these digital spaces that are happy to have you use it so they can figure out how to market to you more effectively.
Right.
And then when you, and I've studied and you taught this, like in one of the, like in the progressive Christian space, for example, like outrage and, associating some negative experience you had with whatever the topic of the day is, so you can have like allied victimhood with it or outrage or whatever, and going over the top and calling something out and all that kind of stuff works. That works in social media better than anything else. And I'm not sure it encourages the best in us. But if you think as platforms, like I know, and I had an argument with a friend the other day, down till I was like, no, I'm not joking. Like literally, you could double your followers in a month of just tweeting once a day, inflammatory, crazy liberal things. All stuff I think in my head and then say, dial that back, Trip. Like, it's not like I see all of my friends post stuff and I want to just hit retweet and then I stop myself because I don't think it actually helps anything. But it does feel really good. And he's like, oh, Trip, I really think you're a little paranoid on this. It's not that bad. I was like, watch. And I posted one thing. It blew up. And I was like, how many times does this have to get retweeted before I delete it? And because people associate you with their tribe. Their tribe is an identity. No one knows how to talk about an identity that's not being threatened, persecuted, or whatever. You say something that's over the top, inflammatory. It's easy to do. We got the craziest president. Like I could just start saying, horrible things about him, and then retweet, and so like I wonder if like we show up in those things because I really want to see my friends' picture with their dogs and see how their kids are doing. I would love if you posted an article you read that you thought was really good. I'd like to hear it, right? But most of what I see because of the algorithms are my friends at their angriest and most vile,
right?
Hoping to get.
I think that's right.
No, they actually, they structure it that way, and so I just feel like we can't go on in a place where our access to the internet we don't pay for with money. We pay for it that our attention is being purchased by advertisers who then succeed to sell us stuff by telling us we're incomplete and we should be more anxious and fearful than we are.
And don't forget selling your personal data to other corporations.
Yeah. So I completely get disengaging from the entire system and how I'm absolutely not going to because, I haven't got a job with health insurance yet with my PhD, so I have to use the internet to pay all my bills. And I've moved so many times, I'm not going to like start asking all my friends to text me individual updates about their life. I want to follow it on Instagram and then leave cute comments. And so I feel this suckered into the system,
Yeah, this is another area that I think needs more research. I've come across a number of researchers that have talked about it, but it's under-researched. And that's how neoliberalism is often talked about as simply an ideology or a type of rationality, which it is. But I'm coming across now researchers are saying it's more an affective, a structure of affect than it is even an ideology. There are certain things we're supposed to feel and to value feeling. And it comes around to what you're talking about. Only exaggerated feelings are going to matter. Almost theatrical feelings matter, not everyday ordinary feelings. So anger and outrage are valued. Grief and mourning are not. Anger and outrage are valued, and excitement and enthusiasm and happiness are valued, but not grief, mourning, and sadness. Grief, mourning, and sadness bring us together. Anger, outrage, and even happiness and exuberance drive us apart. I'm thinking out loud here as a clinician, but I can make an argument for this clinically.
No, and when you say that, I think I could share the exact same post with a different title, and one of them has to do with grief and one with outrage, and I can guarantee you which one will get more response.
There's no question about it. We could make up an empirical research program right here, and I promise you, we know what the outcome would be.
Yeah, and with Facebook ads, you can run A/B tests really easily.
Yeah,
and you can actually see what you would pay per click. So the same article, you give it two different titles, and the same target audience, and they'll find out how much you have to pay per click. And I know the data because I have to pay for clicks half the time. Once Facebook knows that you'll spend money on advertising, they'll just stop showing anything you post unless you spend money. And it's so.
Can I make this even more real for a moment?
Oh yeah,
and do it confessionally. So I'm from DeKalb County, Alabama, originally. I mentioned this in my book toward the beginning, Fort Payne, Alabama. I mentioned what neoliberalization did to my small hometown. It forced all of the factory jobs. It used to be the sock mill capital of the world. 3 out of every 5 pairs of socks sold in the United States were manufactured in my little hometown. So when neoliberalization occurred in the 90s, they went away. So there were 136 sock mills in my hometown of 12,000 people in 1995. By 2001, there were 6. Mm-hmm. All of those jobs have been replaced by low-wage jobs, greeters at Walmart, and so forth, night watchmen at merchandise warehouses, and so forth. Okay. My home county, DeKalb County, Alabama, I looked it up after the election, voted 97% of the vote went to Trump. All right. That pains me, given my own political persuasions. But my father died a year ago in October on the 27th. And I went back home for his funeral. And I experienced community gathered around his casket and his gravesite. I have no doubt that most of the people surrounding me were Trump voters. But in mourning, we all mourned for the same person who had meant a lot to us. And that cut across the polarities that we had politically. My sister and I are on opposite ends of the political spectrum. But when I go home and visit her, we can unite around, our shared memories, our shared pain, and so forth. I don't think this is unique to me. Mm-hmm. And in a country, and this is happening all over Europe, with extreme political movements that are going on in Europe and around the world. We need a way pastorally for people who are that far apart. For example, it's a political spectrum, but it's also an ideological spectrum.
Yeah.
To be able to talk to one another. Mm-hmm. And we are as guilty as anybody on the progressive left to refusing to sit down and talk to people like that who are different from us.
Mm-hmm.
There is a reason that my home county voted for Trump. Is there racism there? Yes. It's a far predominantly white county. But it also had something to do with all those jobs being sent to China back in the 1990s. And when Trump began to talk about all the jobs going out of our country and mentioning China and specifically, he had those people's votes.
Mm-hmm.
A bunch of them are racist, but not all of them are racist.
Yeah. No, and the sad part is the church isn't any better at working across those differences than any other group. Just because you have been baptized into Christ doesn't make it easier. And I think one of the predicament, and this is probably true for a lot of the people that are listening, is that politically you are on the much more left, right? Like,
yes.
It's not like you're sitting there going like, wow, I really hope the Democrats choose a moderate, because actually I've done predicting elections. I had scheduled an entire homebrewed Christianity event for inauguration weekend, assuming we were going to have the first woman president, with a very famous feminist theologian speaking right after it. And then everyone comes in hungover because they all drank so much the night before, knowing what was about to happen. So my political anticipation is very, very poor. So, if a moderate's the only one who'll win, go for it. But for Christians who are very progressive and who see their commitment around, like, let's say class issues or whatever, like we've been talking about, to be important and part of what oppresses everybody, even if they don't recognize it, right? Like when you think of the factories leaving and things, you're like, yeah, well, if you knew this story the way I knew this story, you would definitely not be as thrilled, right? So I think it's sometimes in America, and especially in church context, conservative people demand to be heard and for their position to be legitimate, while not returning the favor very often. No one doubts that you can end up being a Christian and a Republican, but whether you could be a Democratic Socialist in one and a Christian, a large portion of the church is going to be praying for you. So I think that makes a difficult position, and there's a bunch of issues. So, and since moving back to the South after 10 years in Los Angeles, I've talked to a number of family members, and sometimes it's economic issues, sometimes it was race issues, sometimes it's guns. But one of my family members said something when we were having a conversation the last time we had one, because we've decided not to talk about this anymore. He said, around the immigration issue, he said, nobody asked us if we wanted, and this is a rural town in North Carolina, our school's full of a bunch of Hispanics. Like, we didn't ask them to move there. They don't have to be there. If they want to go to the city where you liberals like them, that's fine. But no one asked us. Yeah. And what he was getting at, and I visited the town, it's very different. Like, the school teachers in the family, 2/3 of their class are English as their second language. And and it's not a small, almost all white town in rural North Carolina anymore. So he was not asked permission, and he said no one asked if they came. And then he said it. And then you started effing with our bathroom signs around the transgender bathroom thing that happened in North Carolina. And so I'm trying to figure out how to process how he's experiencing it, because my natural personality or whatever lined up early on led to me enjoying diversity and culture and urban life and wanting to be. I loved being in Los Angeles, so the idea that for him, he wanted the world he was born into, and it was taken from him, and he's resentful. And so he has more guns, is more vocally racist than I've ever heard him, and insistent that now you're starting to mess through bathroom signs, and you got a whole nother agenda going on. And and so for people that are in those situations where you have those types of difference in your family, is there any like advice or tactics or explanation for how to deal with it in a fruitful way, rather than just going, well, you're xenophobic, homophobic, transphobic, ignoramus, and luckily you'll eventually die and we'll move on. Because that's what.
So I'm going to go off script, but not like Trump did the other night. Okay, I'm going to go off script here for a minute, Trip. One of the ways that neoliberalism becomes culture, especially in the way it affects feelings, which I was talking about a while ago, is it feeds off of fear. So Naomi Klein wrote a book some time ago called, what was it? The Shock Doctrine was the name of the book, and she talked about disaster capitalism. So it's a little bit analogous to that. If people are afraid, you can take advantage of them every time, including in the little town in North Carolina you're talking about, including in Fort Payne, Alabama. If they're fearful, they're vulnerable. And under neoliberalism, we have a fearful population in the United States and elsewhere. So, what can we do as ministers, as religious leaders, as Christian believers to respond to this? I'm thinking, so I'm going to go Baptist minister on you now. The Gospel of Mark, the constant refrain through the Gospel of Mark is, be not afraid. Mm-hmm. There's several passages in the Gospel of Mark where this comes up. It's almost like a repeated line. Don't be afraid. I think there's an assumption, why not be afraid? Well, we don't have to be afraid if all of us are in the hands of God and the stranger is our friend. We don't have to be afraid. And I would venture if the people in the town you're talking about could sit down with their Hispanic neighbors and start talking about their kids and start talking about their fears for their kids and how to take care of their kids and their kids' education. If they started talking about taking care of their parents who have dementia and worried about paying for their health care, they would be friends. They would quit being afraid. They would find out that they have more in common than they have difference. And in the churches, if we started talking more about this, the emphasis in the Gospels on the care of the stranger, like the parable of the Good Samaritan. I mean, this is basic stuff, folks. This is basic gospel stuff. Mm-hmm. That just disappears from the radar when we drink the neoliberal Kool-Aid. And suddenly we only think that the only religious issue on the ballot is abortion. Right? Mm-hmm. Well, that's a viable conversation to have, the ethics surrounding abortion, but it's not the only conversation to have if you're a Christian. Debt peonage and financial oppression and people dying because they don't have health care is a faith issue. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think there's a way to address this fear, and I think it's by coming back to talking to each other about the struggles that we face as human beings and realizing we're not as strange as we seem just because we have a different accent or speak a different language or have a different skin color or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't expecting a sermon, and now I feel like I'm ready. I'm ready for Ash Wednesday.
which is upon us.
I know if we might not have found a true democracy yet, but death is one. And
death is democratizing.
Yeah.
Birth and death.
Yeah. So I really appreciate you taking all the time to talk. And is there anywhere you want to direct people for more information, how to connect, all that kind of stuff?
Well, aside from the books I've written, the book I've written and some of the other things I've mentioned that I've talked about are resources. I would say, too, I should give a plug for things that are happening in theological education. And we have not talked enough about economic injustice, class, capitalism in theological schools. But I do want to mention that at Vanderbilt Divinity School, just started this year. Mm-hmm. We have an endowed program. The actual title of the program is the Wendland Cook Program in Religion and Justice. But the emphasis of the program is economic and ecological justice. And we have scholarships for this program. So for your listeners out there, some of whom may know people or may themselves be thinking about getting involved in a theological program where they might not have to borrow every penny of their education, who are worried about the kinds of issues you and I have talked about today, I'd want them to be aware of that program. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's another one like it in the country, and we need to be educating people as well as bringing them together to talk about their grief.
Yeah. And that's and for those that are regular listeners, Jorg Rieger is a part of that program.
Jorg Rieger is the director of that program. You're right. And Jorg Rieger is one of the few theologians, along with Catherine Tanner that I mentioned earlier, that's talking about class and capitalism. Mm-hmm. So the book is in paperback. Hopefully the price will drop even from where it is now. So it's kind of like thinking like the market now, you buy low. So watch for the price to drop if you're interested in it. And I appreciate this time, Trip. It's been a fun conversation.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. And, I think people will, but don't like when I really, really like a book, it usually means I'm wanting to ask the questions I think about after I read it rather than do the best job getting people into the book. So okay. That's why we didn't even get through but half my topics that I wrote down.
Okay.
So we'll have to do it again. And
we'll have to follow it up sometime. Thanks, Trip.
Yes. Thank you tons.